All right, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Anyone who's not in my class who is stopping by. So excited that Monica Moon is joining us tonight. As you guys all know, we are building website portfolios this year. We're making the leap. We're getting rid of the books. It's a long time coming. And so really excited that Monica is going to share her experience with us. She has been working on websites for over 15 years. She's been, part of over 100 website projects, and she's also been hiring manager for many of her jobs for over 10 years, hiring designers. So she knows a thing or two about websites, about portfolios, about interviewing, all the stuff that you guys want to know about, all the stuff that we need to understand as we start to build these websites. So she's going to share a bit of her knowledge and her experience with us. I'd like to ask you guys to all save your questions for the end. Let's let Monica go through her presentation, and at the end we'll swing back and do a little bit of a Q&A. So as you go through, or as she goes through the presentation, kind of prepare some questions, some things that come to mind. It can be about a portfolio website, but it can also be about anything else. She's a UX strategist, she's a visual designer, and like I said, she knows interviews. She's done so many of them in the past. She's seen so many portfolios come across her desk. So definitely prepare those questions, guys. So without further ado, Monica, take it away. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, everybody. Excited to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces and names on here from portfolio reviews and things like that in the past. So hello, I see you and I recognize you. But yeah, I'm happy to be chatting with you guys today. I've, in essence, jam-packed 30 slides full of everything I wish I would have been told when I was in the same seat that you're in. So I'm going to give you guys as much information as possible. And then, as mentioned, I'm an open book. So any Q&A, there's no question that's weird or scary or whatever, just ask away and I'll give you feedback based on my experience. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here's the main stuff we're going to chat about today. First one is process, right? It's always tricky pulling together any website, let alone a portfolio where it's like your baby and all of your stuff, right? So where to get started, everything content-wise from the text to the overall higher level layout to what should you be documenting along the way as you work on any project now or in the future. So that's overall the process. And then I threw in here some fun slides on things like the interview process and things that you may not think of, but stuff that you should prep ahead, stuff you should be ready for during the interviews. So some tips and tricks there. And then some overall insights. As was mentioned, I have looked at quite a few portfolios over the time, as well as working on my own over the years. It's always an evolving process. And so I'll give you kind of some insights from myself and some friends I reached out to in the industry of, what are your tips and tricks? What would you want to know? And then also at the end, I threw in some references, everything from a photo of some favorite books to who I follow on Instagram and more. So let's dive in. Oh, and also I exported a PDF of this, and so I can share that afterwards for you guys. Okay, so obviously this is not me. This is me. Currently a senior UX product designer at Thermo Fisher Scientific. We have about 75,000 employees there. One of our branches is in Carlsbad, so I'm part of a UX team there. There's about 30 or so of us in our group, and we focus on that. But earlier in my career, I started heavy on the branding side, visual design, and then got more and more into UI and now into UX. So I've kind of done a little bit of this, little bit of that, as well as hiring for all of those different roles as well. So good stuff. Here's some of the people I've got to work with. Lots of cool people, lots of learnings, a lot of learning what to do, what not to do. And then here's a 60-second video that I have. This is just one case study that I did, and I thought you guys might kind of like to see the behind the scenes on one of my projects, and then we can go into yours. And this project in a nutshell was everything from the ground up. So brand new company, so branding, visual design, UX strategy, creative directing, photo shoots. So kind of a big range of deliverables. And this video I didn't make, but I did create a lot of the content. It was actually made at the last agency that I worked out called Elevated. We had a video editor. So that's just kind of a quick peek. Let me get that stopped. Okay, enough about me. That's enough background. So let's get into the process, right? So as I'm sure you've realized, the more people you talk to, the more different opinions you have on this, right? Some people have these crazy elaborate processes and they say you have to do every single step along the way. Other people have very simple ones, but at the end of the day, just please don't let it suck. Keep it interesting, show your personality in it, and keep the content really clean and direct. And so I'll go into that a lot more in depth. But the main thing I've noticed is a lot of people treat their portfolio almost like as a one-time project, like here's a brochure and it's done. But what you should really look at it is treat yourself like the client and treat yourself with the same respect that you would with a client. You know, document your whole process, really give it a thorough, thought through, you know, time it deserves in essence. And some of the things that I like to do going into that is always starting with a creative brief. A creative brief, in the past, I've seen it where it's like 3 questions on a sheet of paper, and other companies will have a 30-page doc. Again, everybody handles this very different. So I summed up, if you only answer a few questions, what they should be. So I'll show you that in a second. And then of course, the sitemap and content. A sitemap and the information architecture, that could get like really elaborate really fast. But the most important thing is to really hone in on the main topics and the main goals that you have for your site and making sure that's on the homepage and the navigation. Because some people will look just instantly at your homepage and then they're done, right? But they'll at least look at the navigation of what else do you have available? Do you have a testimonials button? Do you not? Do you have an about button? What could be in that? Is it a form? Is it a paragraph? You know, what could it be? So think a lot about your homepage and your navigation, and then you can start honing in on the details within it. And then of course the layout, right? The layout's the fun part. Most of the times I've worked with people on their portfolios, they go straight into design. They're like, I just want it to look super cool and work on the branding of it, which is important to show your personality, but you really got to think about the content and making sure it's really important for your target audience. So let's get into that more. So with that, you know, there is so many approaches. This I call a waterfall approach. And what that means is complete one step and then move on to the next. Complete one step, move on to the next. Versus a more agile approach, you're like constantly reworking, and then kind of moving on. So it's a little bit different. But overall, top level with this is, first off, you want to kick it off. You know you need one, it's time to go, right? So then you need to do some discovery. And what I mean by discovery, this is things like having a creative brief, you know, ask yourself some serious questions, make sure you stay on target with those goals, as well as just look at other people's sites. What else is other people doing out there? What style, design, aesthetic, and content do you like from other sites? And it doesn't have to be portfolio sites. It could be the industry you're interested in, agencies you're interested in, whatever it may be. But do some initial discovery, just kind of let your mind go, do some general research, and start gathering ideas, almost like mood boards. And then from there, you can start thinking a little bit more about the information architecture, AKA things like sitemaps and stuff. And what I usually do with that is I'll start by gathering stickies, right? So I'll literally just try to find the biggest wall I can find in my house, get a pile of sticky notes, and start jotting down what is important. If someone goes to my site, what do I want them to remember? What do I want them to look at? And just start covering your wall. And then for each of those stickies, start adding more and more stickies, and then start gathering similar topics, right? It sounds kind of simple, but that will start to develop what is your navigational system, what is your information architecture. And then the more you expand that, the more it turns into the main content for things like your homepage or your about page or portfolio sections. So that's kind of a nice way to ramp it up and get started. And then from there, you start working on the content. Consider this almost like your rough draft, right? You don't have to launch with this, but definitely focus in on the content more and figuring out what that structure and stuff's going to be. And then now you kind of know, okay, This is how I want to be represented. These are the topics I want to talk on. So now go back and do more research. Who else has those same goals, right? Because at the end of the day, even your classmates, you're kind of competition, but at the same time, your classmates could also hire you or lead you to a job, right? So it's like you want to make sure that you're looking at all of these diverse portfolios, different ways of handling these same situations to both pull in consistencies so that employers have, these core things they're always looking for, but also finding ways to find out how you could stand out a little bit, right? So if everyone's doing everything one exact way, maybe you can throw in something a little special or different. And then going into things like UX and wireframes. So structure it out a little bit more, figure out what's above the fold, because oftentimes, especially with your homepage, people aren't going to scroll below the fold. So you have a couple seconds to kind of grab their attention, show them something, and then they'll potentially scroll, and then they'll potentially go to subpages where they're more likely to scroll, but maybe they're not scrolling like 10 scrolls, right? So you really have to think about what's most important, keep it up top, keep it kind of short and direct, and then you can elaborate and grow from there. So at this point, you kind of figured out what you want to do, what the structure is, and now go back to content, right? Now you know your framework, so you can really get in there and make sure it's fine-tuned, as well as adding all of your visual and branding and making it look super cool, and then launching it, right? And we'll get into that a little bit more later. You're not expected to be a developer. You don't have to actually develop this. And there's actually a lot of template sites and bases out there that can get you up and running with a professional site pretty easy. And so you can use that as a foundation and then build in your own custom content within it to make it for you. All this other stuff you see here on the left, that's like intense agency stuff. You don't have to worry about that for your portfolio, but I wanted to let you know in an overall website process, oftentimes you really have to think about the post-launch, right? How I think of that in connection with the portfolio website is you have to go in planning ahead your post-launch of how are you going to promote it? Are you going to put out links on LinkedIn? Are you going to have a preview image of it? What's going to be your like one sentence bio about yourself versus a paragraph about yourself? Are you going to send out an email to friends and family to get out the word, hey, I'm looking and here's my stuff. My specialties are 1, 2, 3, things like that. So think not only of the site, but when you're done with it and it launches, it's really exciting, to have it real to the world, but how are you going to tell the world about it? So I feel like I wouldn't be doing my due diligence if I didn't put in a really scary slide about all the other processes you can consider with the website. Again, this is like really specific where people are very particular about the process they do. Like if you talk to people at Intuit, they have a system kind of like the double diamond, but they call it the triple diamond. And that is their like go-to process for everything versus other companies prefer, the Google design process and maybe more sprint formats or, so every company is a little different. So this is a good kind of slide to just at least do, a half an hour search on these things, do a little bit more in depth because these terms will come up. So it's good to kind of be aware of them. Okay, so now let's get into some super fun stuff. So you really have to do a deep dive on yourself, right? Like what truly is your goal? Because there's nothing worse than having someone come into an interview and they're like, well, I do every single thing you could ever imagine. Whatever you need, I can do it. Because then you're like, well, what are you actually good at? Or what do you really want to do? Because if you say you can do absolutely everything perfect and you love doing everything, then you're going to get a lot of random projects that might not be your specialty or what you want to do. Of course, you do need to be flexible and try new things, but it's really good to know if you had to identify 1 or 2 things that are your specialty, what are they and why? Like, why do you feel passionate about those? And then also think about how those connect to a greater business goal, right? Because depending on who you're interviewing with, if you're interviewing with a creative director, they might be a little bit more into the emotional, oh, it feels like this, and then it makes users get really excited about XYZ. But if the person that's hiring you is more perhaps on the marketing management side, product management side, something like that, they're going to want to know how does it help the bottom line. So you would need to spin it of, well, I want to be a visual designer because I know designs have an emotive quality that could connect to users and help the bottom line and help sales. Sales can be helped by creating a marketing campaign, a variety of these materials of which I can make in print and design or blah, blah, blah. So first, just figuring out what your specialty is, and then knowing you kind of have to pitch it two ways, depending on who you're talking to. Okay, here is a short and sweet creative brief. I know this sounds kind of silly, and some people are like, even clients that I've been working with for years, they're like, do I have to fill this out? I don't want homework, you know? But just having a few key questions and then circling back to them throughout the process will really help. Because sometimes as we as creatives get into a project, we kind of get so lost in the details that sometimes we miss the top level goal and, you know, what is the main scope. And so things as simple as like, if you have one thing to say and they're looking at it for just 2 seconds, what is it? Make sure that's obvious. Make sure it's big and bold and they can't miss it, right? And then from there, there's a variety of details with all that, right? So not only do you want them to see all your super cool stuff, but what's your call to action? And what I mean by that is make sure you make it really obvious for them what you want them to do. You know, like now that you've seen my stuff, please email me if you're interested in a portfolio review, or please call this number for, you know, I'd love to buy you a cup of coffee and just get general feedback on my portfolio. I'm always expanding and growing, or, you know, looking for a current position in these exact roles. Please connect to me on LinkedIn if you're interested, blah, blah, blah. So just think about what is the main goal that you want them to do and make it really easy for them to do that. Because a lot of times I'll see portfolio sites and they look stellar and I'm searching and searching and searching and I can't find any contact info. And so there's nothing worse than you could have had a shot, but I don't know how to get a hold of you, you know, and then I become like weird cyber stalker feel where I'm like, well, I guess I got to look them up on LinkedIn and see if I can find them, and it gets awkward. So don't make people do that. And then overall, why should they hire you? I know that sounds like a simple question, but it's really hard for people to answer sometimes, right? Because talent isn't enough. You have to have the talent to get your foot in the door, but what really makes you essential to their team? Is it that you're a great communicator? You're a great problem solver? Is it that you know how to work with diverse teams with different levels of talent and expertise and finding the message that they need to portray? You know, like what is the special reasons that they really need to hire you beyond just, you know, your stellar designs? And overall personality and visual goals. For anybody here that loves branding, I geek out over branding even though I don't do it much these years. This part's the really fun part, right? What are your colors? What are your fonts? What's it gonna look and feel like? You know, how do you represent yourself as a brand? And that is important, but the content is just as much or more important. And so overall, think of things, you know, how do you want to represent yourself at the end of the day, right? Just like you pick out an outfit before an interview that represents you, how is your portfolio site doing that? And the majority of that could be on your about page. And the main reason I emphasize that is sometimes there's so much personality on like a home page that you kind of get lost in the work, or the colors contrast against the work and the work isn't the star anymore. So just kind of having a balance of that and how you tell your story. And who is your main target audience, right? So this goes back to treating your website like you would for a client. For a client, you would figure out like, well, who are they trying to sell to, or who are they targeting? Well, it's the same thing for yourself, right? What's your dream job? What state is it in? What city is it in? Are you open to relocating? If it's local, research the agencies or the companies. What's their dynamic with their team? Is it a huge group? Is it a small group where you wear a lot of hats? Just who is your target audience? And then use things like LinkedIn, right? See if anyone you know is connected, anyone that works there, ask to get your foot in the door. See if people will give you just like portfolio feedback. Because by asking for portfolio feedback, in essence, it's saying, hey, can I have an interview without the pressure? And so it kind of helps get your foot in the door there too. But again, by knowing your main target audience and really honing in on who they are, then you can start figuring out like, well, how do I meet these people? You know, what events are they going to? What social platforms are they using? And then, you know, what do they think of you? anyone there currently know you? So you kind of have an in. Is it almost like a cold call where you're really coming in from the ground level? All that stuff is really important to know in your portfolio. If you do have expertise or things, you know, showing things like logos of who you've worked with is great. But if you're coming in really fresh from a start, then you really want to maybe emphasize that, you know, can't wait to learn and grow and expand. Here's different ways I've done so far, things like that. And then who are your competitors? So I kind of joked about this earlier, like I see all your faces on the Zoom meeting and you're all kind of competitors for somewhat similar jobs to a degree, but you're also each other's advocates to get each other jobs. Even to this day, like after I graduated, I don't know, 16 years ago or something, I'm still in contact with all those people I went to school with. And we're close and we're always asking each other, like, hey, I'm looking to hire this role. Know anybody? Oh, so-and-so applied here a month ago. They may still be looking. And we always give each other leads. So always stay in contact with each other and kind of help each other out wherever you can. And then website top 3 to 5 pages. Oftentimes I found portfolio sites are really intimidating, right? You want to put in every piece you've ever done and you want everything to look perfect and you can't launch it until it's all absolutely perfect. But that's too much pressure. Really just start, you know, get the core pages in, focus on the top 3 to 5 pages to start, and then you can expand it later. It's a living, growing thing. So don't be afraid to maybe have just a few pieces at first. But if you do, let's say you only put 4 portfolio pieces, make sure they're big and bold and they take up a whole page. So they're not like 4 itsy bitsy squares. And then they kind of, it's just like, you know, a mental game a little bit there, but just be aware of how many pieces you have and how you're going to emphasize some pieces over another, potentially. And then, of course, things like what's the budget, right? Everyone wants a custom site, pretty much. They want to design it from scratch, wireframe it out, make it totally custom. But you really don't have to do that for a portfolio site. You could definitely start with these templates and you know, utilize them, change the colors, change the fonts, put in your pieces, and kind of get up and going. But that's good to identify up front, because if you have the budget for a developer or a buddy that maybe wants to partner where they're growing and they want to grow their development skills, you want to grow your design skills, you could potentially group together. So just knowing your budget up front will help you too. Okay, so let's get to the basics. That's a lot of stuff, right? Where do you start? So text. This is like that sticky note exercise I mentioned, right? Brainstorm topics and group them, and then you can start seeing things like the nav and your main content for your pages kind of evolve. The sitemap doesn't have to be crazy. You have your homepage, obviously. Some people will do in essence, almost like a one-page site, and then you click in for a detail page. That's okay too, but make sure people have a way to contact you if you don't have an about page. Because those one-page sites plus detail pages look cool, but it's harder to find out how to contact people. So make sure it's in the footer or in the nav or somewhere really obvious. And then consider things on the about page. Oftentimes I'll see a big paragraph and a big photo. It's cool like getting to see the person because you kind of feel like, oh, now I'm connected to them more. But don't do a big paragraph. Do like maybe a couple sentences, some bullet points, maybe talk about associations or ways you gave back to the community with design. You know, really add your personality and show how you care about this community and growing and evolving with it. And just do as many bullet points as possible. Avoid big paragraphs because no one's going to read them. Sorry. And then content flow. This is something, of course, we think about when we have printed books. You know, like we have a chapter intro and a subhead and what's the challenges, what's the solution, stuff like that. But you want to make sure you really pull that through to your portfolio site, because a lot of times when you get to the design details, I'll see where it's just like a whole bunch of images or a whole bunch of huge paragraphs with like maybe 1 or 2 images of just the final piece. And that doesn't really do the trick. You really got to think about the structure more, right? So it is good to have things like the challenges, the solutions, again, just bullet points, short and sweet bullet points. What was your role in it? What was the specialties that you brought to the table? And then to really show the process with the images with short and sweet text next to each thing to kind of explain the story behind it. So visuals, really, really often If it's like, for example, a UI designer, I'll see a giant screen with this beautiful above the fold image, but there won't be anything on the process. And that's pretty much an immediate no-go for most hiring people, unless that's like part of a branding campaign, right? Where it's like, here's my fonts, here's my colors, and here's how it could be interpreted into a website. But if you really want to emphasize your specialty, you have to show the process around it. And that works with any discipline that you're hoping to get into, whether you prefer branding or graphic design or traditional marketing, UI interfaces, e-commerce, UX strategy, whatever it is, do a deep dive in that and really show the process. And the best way to do that, take way more photos than you ever thought you'd need. Like even if you're meeting or brainstorming or doing a Zoom meeting, you know, collaborating on your thoughts, just take some photos. Worst case, you don't use it. But best case, you can show this little documentation and really tell the story start to finish. And that could be things even too, again, like sticky note sessions or brainstorming or sketches. Just document everything, just chuck it in a digital folder. Also, if you do have print pieces, always photograph them. You don't need to hire a professional photographer. I've literally, both for myself and clients in the past, got like giant white poster board from like the grocery store, you know, set it in the corner of a room, gather every light I can from my house, aim it at it, you know, and kind of do a get a rig photo shoot, and then optimize Photoshop to crop out backgrounds, add drop shadows, and kind of make it as perfect as can be. So just do what you can with the resources available, and that's fine. Down the line, if you want to add in cool textures or, you know, build up the pieces or take more elaborate photos, that's great. But just work with what you got. That's totally fine. But print pieces, definitely take a photo of them, because if you just show it like as a flat rectangle, it loses its impact. Like how is the user going to use that? Like, does it move? Does it interact? You know, people want to kind of see it in real life. I've even seen some people in their digital portfolios where they'll have videos autoplay, where they'll have like a poster that's opening up and they hold it and then they actually open it up and then they pause and then they fold it back together and put it in a pocket and walk off, or things like that, right? So you can utilize the digital environment more than just having static photos too. Of course, that can get a little more elaborate. It just kind of depends. But there's lots of ways you can document stuff. So this slide is scary. This slide is not fun. In essence, 6 seconds is the average time a resume or website is viewed by a hiring manager. I remember the first time I saw this, I was like, oh, that's really depressing. But the more I thought about it, that's probably right. You get about 6 seconds, people glance at your work. They'll usually open the first 1 to 2 pieces and then the last one. And then that's when they make a judgment call if they want to do a deeper dive. So they do a really quick top level above the fold, look at your stuff, and then they figure out whether they want to invest more time or not. So with that, you got to be direct, right? No filler, just immediately state your specialty and what you hope to achieve. If you put everything in the kitchen sink there again, that's going to be limiting. Like a lot of times I'll see people put like graphic designer, illustrator, branding specialist, and UX strategy. So it's like, well, if we're hiring you for a UX strategy role and I see that, you're immediately not considered, because we're not hiring an illustrator or a branding specialist. And if you listed those first in the order too, I assume you care about them less. So just something to consider. It's great if you have this big depth of specialties, but make sure you really focus on what you really want to do and what jobs you plan to apply to. And also look into the wording of those jobs, right? So when you see them on things like LinkedIn, what's the terminology that those people are using in describing the job? You want to use similar terminology. Also on your LinkedIn, that terminology is all search engine driven, meaning if you're utilizing the same types of terminology for the actual tasks that you do, like you never want to lie, obviously, but look at the terminology, because every company will describe similar roles different. And if you're using the same terms they are, it's putting your name higher on the search results for them as well. So it's kind of getting you a foot in the door behind the scenes. So the wording is really important. And then for those thumbnails, I say start and end with the best. Some people are like, well, why end with the best? It's because most hiring managers, most people don't talk about this, but they'll look at the first like 1 or 2, maybe 3 pieces. And then the assumption is that your worst work is the last one. So if they see your best work and your worst work, they kind of get an idea of your range. And so put a piece that's kind of good that you still like, but it's not your favorite, and make it last, because it'll end with more impact. Sometimes people will put the last piece where it was like a sketch they did in a class like 5 years ago and they kind of like it, but they just kind of chucked it in there. And then all of a sudden it takes down like the professionalism. So make sure the last piece is good too. And the dream job, show the type of work you want to do. It's great to dabble and try all types of different design disciplines and specialties and techniques and approaches. But as you fill out that creative brief and you figure out what your perfect job is, really try to gear yourself for that job. Show the type of work that you really want to do. Because if you show, oh, I used to do a lot of production work, so I'm going to put it in there because I did it. Well, now you're leading yourself into continuing that same type of work that you may or may not want to do. So make sure it just matches what your actual goal is. And then things like the background, list the deliverables and scope. The other people work on it. Did you lead it? Were you more a supporting role? Just be very honest and direct with that stuff. So we talked a bit about LinkedIn, but it's really important. Even in writing your LinkedIn portfolio, or sorry, your kind of intro page, think of things like that terminology, right? Think of things like how many past jobs do you put in there? Don't put in the restaurant job that you had, put in just like industry jobs or volunteer experience that you did, things like that. Try to keep it all industry based if you can, even if it's just one thing, or if you've done some freelance, then you can put yourself in as a freelancer on there, but try to keep it industry based if you can. Okay, so now we're saying you have your portfolio. It's awesome and direct, and it has all this good stuff in it. So now it's time for the interview. Sometimes I don't go into this, but I think it's important to consider the interview because there's so many levels to it. For example, I've had some people show up to an interview, and I say some because it's happened more than once, where they'll show up and they got their computer ready to go and the battery's dead and they have no charger and now they're stuck. And so now they're verbally telling me about all their projects and all their process and strategy. So something as simple as like have a printed backup. You do not need a book. It could just be from your home printer or from Kinko's, or even just printed pages from your portfolio website showing a few key pieces that are your favorites. Doesn't have to be everything, but picture the worst case scenario. There's a blackout, there's no computer, your battery's dead. How are you going to represent yourself, right? And then be flexible with the pitch. Interviews can be tricky. Sometimes the interviewee will plan on giving you 60 minutes and all of a sudden they got given a crazy deadline behind the scenes that has nothing to do with you. And now they're like, okay, you have 15 minutes, go, right? Don't be thrown off by that and don't take it personally. That kind of stuff happens. So what you need to do going into it is know like your elevator pitch, right? And by that, I mean, if you're in an elevator with someone that could potentially hire you, what's your like 1 to 2 sentences of how you'd sum up yourself and your specialty, right? Or if there's only 1 or 2 sentences you want them to remember about you, what is it? And then elaborate on that. Okay, well, what if you have 5 minutes? Ooh, what would you go over in 5 minutes, versus 15 or 30? So just look at it as kind of chunks, and that you might have really short time or you might have really, really long time. So how are you going to kind of pace it out and show the stuff and describe yourself? And then research, of course. This sounds pretty obvious, but it's a good reminder. Look up the company, their culture, their mission, their structure. Because if you could throw in little tidbits like, oh, I see your mission is blah, blah, blah. I also feel strongly about that. And this is why. Those things will get you major brownie points. Like literally your name will go from here on the list to whoop, get you up a little higher. So little research goes a long way. And be prepared with questions. There's nothing worse than an interview where someone just like shows all their work and it's beautiful work, but they never look up at you and they only, look at their book or on screen, and then at the end of it, they just sit there and stare at you. And it's like, oh no. And so just have some questions, you could even ask them semi-personal questions like, I see you're in this role. I'd love to know more about why you chose this company and how your role is best fitted for it too, and how you picture the team you're hiring for can help you, right? Like, how can I help you succeed in your role? That's like one question you can ask. So come in with a few questions. Start with only a couple. You also don't want to overwhelm them, like where you like pull out a scroll and start going down the list. But, have some questions ready to go. And be also ready to focus on a couple key pieces. Because once employers see a couple pieces that are really elaborate, they get your process. From there, they could kind of almost get a skim of the other pieces, and they assume that you do the same full process for everything. So don't plan on showing everything in the kitchen sink, but go really in depth on one or two very diverse projects, right? So if you like branding, one could be like a logo campaign, and one could be like a whole set of print collateral. If you do UX, one could be, you know, a touch screen for a product interface, and one can be an e-commerce website, things like that. So also make them diversified and as different as you possibly can. And then bring stuff, you know, bring resumes and business cards. People still keep business cards and use them, you know, so if you do get an in-person, try to have those items. And if you don't, email the resumes and some samples and your link afterwards. And also, you know, be thankful. Send a simple thank you note. I have a pile of thank you notes from the last 15 years of anyone that's ever given it to me. If you get something handwritten from something, it's almost like sacrilegious. You can't throw it away. It's just like bad mojo. And so you hold on to it. And I've hired people from those thank you notes. I'll be like, oh yeah, who is that person? They specialize in branding and they had the bicycle card. And then I find it and then I'll call them up. So a little thing like a thank you note goes a really long way. And make sure in the interview that you always ask what's next, right? Because you don't want to have to become like the email stalker afterwards, like, you know, you haven't responded. Is everything okay? Do you like me? You know, just ask, say, you know, is it okay for me to contact you next week on Monday and send you an email to see the status, you know, or, you know, how long do you picture this hiring process going? Will you be looking over candidates over the next 2 weeks, 2 days, 2 months? You know, kind of get a feel for how long it's going to be. Because I know at like Thermo Fisher, a lot of people, it could be like a 6-month process of interviews to get in. It could be quite elaborate. And then other jobs, I've interviewed at agencies before where I'm like, so can you start tomorrow? So it can really vary depending on where it is. So it's good to kind of know where you stand. So a couple insights here, and then I'm going to wrap up and open it up for Q&A. But overall, be yourself, right? And be humble and confident. Don't go in there like, I am the best at everything in the world, and, you know, I have no room to grow. I'm perfect. You know, just be yourself and be humble. Talk about areas that you hope to grow. We're all constantly growing, and no one knows everything. So, you know, just be honest about your aspirations of where you want to go and how you want to evolve. Also be cautious of immediately saying within 2 years you want to be a creative director. Hiring managers hear that a lot and they're like, oh, so you're coming for my job. Okay. I know it sounds silly, but just say like, I'd like to work my way up. And as I continue to learn, to have titles that represent that. It's like saying the same thing, but it's not like being snarky. So just little tips there. And this one I threw in because it's really funny and I don't think people think of it, but so often if your portfolio has a lot of student work, I'll hear for every, you know, client or piece, they'll say, oh, I picked this client because I really love outdoor concerts and they do outdoor concerts and here's how I brought their brand to life. And that immediately discredits all your work, right? So avoid saying I picked this client because what it kind of says, even though it's not intentional, is if I really like the client and they're essentially me, I'll do really great work. But what you really want to say is no matter what the client is or what the challenge is, I could take it on and make something stellar to achieve their goals and help their users. That's really what you want to focus on. So avoid saying I picked this client and instead present the work as if it's final, but always tell the truth if it's a student piece. Never ever lie. Just avoid saying like I picked this because, or, you know, I love this color so I used it. You know, things like that, because some clients hate certain colors and they would never let you proceed with it. So it's just kind of a red flag that it's student work. Okay, here's a couple references and then we're a wrap. So Design Toolbox, as you know, there's a million different tools and every year there's a new one. So I definitely don't feel like at any point I could say you have to know these specific tools and that's it or something, because it's always changing and we're always evolving and trying new things. But what I did do is I took a screenshot of my footer of apps that you'll see down there. This is what I use on a daily basis in my current job. My last job though, we used very different tools, right? We always had the Creative Suite, we would use Sketch and things like that, but we didn't use tools in my past, like Zeppelin and Miro, but this company, it's a mandatory. And down the line, I think it's going to be more like Adobe XD over Sketch. That's a personal opinion. Right now, we're all Sketch, but I could definitely see that evolving and changing over time. So in essence, at least dabble and test out, you know, maybe a quick project in Sketch and then another one in XD, you know, and just try out a couple different things based on whatever the specialty is that you have. So that way you could at least say, oh, well, I have a knowledge of this program, but I would need to do a deeper dive to catch up. You know, they just want to know that you're at least aware of different programs they may use and that you can kind of adapt and grow into it. And then, of course, launching the portfolio website. There's a bazillion websites out there that can help you with this. A lot of the ones I've seen lately is like Behance, WordPress, Squarespace, and sometimes fully custom. But that's usually if you're a unicorn or you know a unicorn, that you can do the fully custom route. Again, the other ones are fine. Just take the template and kind of make it your own, right? And here's part of my bookshelf. I think this is kind of funny, but I still like books. I'm on the computer all day, every day, probably 10 hours a day. So when I could disconnect, I put on a record and I grab a book. It's kind of like silly and old school, but I think it's good. And there's a lot of good ones out there. The Lean Product Playbook, if you're into UX, will be really, really good for you to see the different disciplines of UX. Of course, there's, you know, what is typography, ego, those ones a little bit more on the graphic design realm. And then there's even kind of new technology stuff like virtual reality for UX, things like that. So there's all types of good stuff out there. My Instagram, I use it over half the time just for like references and gathering ideas. I'm constantly looking at different visual approaches, different processes, different tools. These are just a handful of people that I follow. I'm also now, again, more on the purely UI UX side, but in my past, this would have been all branding and packaging and more kind of the traditional stuff. Oh, and by the way, that's kind of important to know. When I applied to this job I'm currently at 2 years ago, I stripped out everything branding, everything packaging, all logos, all of it. And all I showed was UX with a dab of UI. And so they didn't even know I knew how to do that stuff until I'd been working there a few years. So talk about really hone in on your specialty and the job you want. Just kind of an example. Okay, that's way too much of me talking. I want to hear from you guys. What's your passion? What do you have questions on? How can I maybe help you? I'm an open book, so bring it on.
Thank you so much, Monica. That was super insightful. Yeah, let's go ahead and open it up to questions. I'll go ahead and moderate the Q&A. So if you guys have a question, raise your hand so we can talk one at a time. And I also wanted to say that at the end, Monica wants to get a good screenshot of everyone in sort of Zoom. You know, she talked a little bit about taking a lot of photos and documenting your process. This is part of her process. So let's get her a really good photo. So I want everyone, you know, if you feel comfortable, to get on camera for that final shot. So if there's any like thing you need to fix with your hair, get that going so that we can finish with that screenshot. But yeah, Sylvia, why don't you go ahead and answer or ask your question?
Thanks. Hi, Monica. Wondering, when you mentioned, you know, letting the content being the star and not letting your design get in the way of your content. Like what I've been looking at portfolio sites lately and being surprised by how many of them are just so hard to navigate because of that. And I'm wondering what sort of design trends you're seeing that are really common now that we might want to avoid because they're just disrupting the experience.
Oh boy. Well, there's a lot of trends that I see continually popping up. One of them is the way that you show the work, where if it is digital in nature, it'll be a giant screen with above the fold screenshot and a giant paragraph. And that's just like, you might as well not show anything. Like, it's not helpful to the employers. What they would want to see is start with that, you know, give this description, get some core stuff above the fold that's really important. And then from there, maybe on the rest of the page, balance it out, right? So for every image you show or every talking point you want, have an image that sums that up. Like, you know how they joke that like in ads, you should be able to put it on mute and it still makes sense? It's the same thing. Your visuals should tell the story if they don't want to read it. And then if you read it, it should describe the story just as well without the visuals. So if you have both of them, you're gonna achieve both the analytical reviewer as well as more of the visually driven viewer. So really avoid the trends of just like one huge image of just a final piece, and then the person hits next and sees another piece and sees another piece. That's not doing you any credit. So make sure you have those kind of key balances in there for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Awesome.
of course. Great question.
Go ahead, Shay.
I had to unmute. So one thing, so you're talking about know your specialty and kind of work with it.
Yeah.
When you're an illustrator who happens to be able to do graphic design as well, like, is it worth it to go for jobs that are graphic design, or should you focus on illustration and just kind of like, oh, by the way, I also do graphic design?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've worked with a lot of illustrators over the time. Is most of your illustrations more kind of print and digital based?
A lot of it, my main like breadwinning work is children's books and things like that. So it is definitely more cartoon based or like fan fiction and things like that. So it works really well for book covers and original characters and things like that. But anything outside of that, and environmental, it works well for environmental work as well.
Okay. The main reason I ask is because I have friends that do animation, and it's kind of the hardcore, literally like making cartoons and movies. And so then demo reels and little segments are the most important for them and really pushing that. But in your case, I think you definitely want to emphasize the graphic design, because I think that might help you get your foot in the door at a corporation or potentially an agency more often than just illustration. Because a lot of times if people want just illustration, they're hiring you freelance. So if you want to be a full-time freelancer, that's fine. But if you want to have kind of a 9-to-5 office job, you'll want to emphasize the graphic design just as much as the illustration, and show how your illustrations end up in a real piece, right?
Gotcha.
So that way you can kind of show like, here's a real marketable piece that's illustration based, and here's behind the scenes how I got it there. I think that'll really help you market yourself and show them your diverse qualities. I've worked with a lot of illustrators, and they pushed just for graphic design to get their foot in the door. And then they started utilizing their illustration talents more and more once they got in.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Sean.
Hey, Monica, Sean Bacon. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, Sean.
I said a really simple question. You mentioned a piece of software that you are using more and more, and it wasn't Sketch, and I missed what you said. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. There's a bunch of tools that I've been dabbling with more and more, especially in the remote world.
Yeah.
For example, Miro is one that I use a lot. They actually allow you to have a free project, and the access is a little bit less, but you can dabble with it right now. Anyone can with the free account. But what Miro is primarily if you do UX or strategy-based stuff, or if you want to show things like your brainstorming process and creative process to come to conclusions, it's really great for that. It has like sticky note stuff. It has flow maps, site maps. I personally use it for workshops where we'll have 20 people or more in there, and I'm leading them through Miro and gathering ideas and coming up with solutions. So Miro is a tool I use a lot lately, almost on a daily basis for collaboration purposes.
Yeah, that was the one you said. I missed the name, and I needed to write it down so I can go find it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Miro is good for collaboration. I still use Sketch for most of my layouts, Photoshop for some stuff that's more in-depth design or supporting graphics. And then, of course, like Illustrator is a go-to for illustration and vector-based art. That's kind of a standard go-to. And Adobe XD, I think, is going to take over and eliminate Sketch in a couple of years, but that's all speculation.
Cool. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Jamie, go ahead.
In your opinion, Monica, what is the most important part of the UX process?
Oh, that's so tricky. I think process is key. If you can't communicate your process and your specialty within it, that's really tough. And what I mean by that is like a lot of people that I see that apply to strictly UX roles, like in my current position, we're actually hiring right now for a few full-time UX roles, and it's really hard to find the person that can properly communicate that, meaning They can show, here's my really in-depth sitemap, here's my task flows, I understand user personas, and I do 2 to 3, and here's why. And then for each of those, I do a task flow to make sure we're, achieving each user's key special needs, things like that, as well as, the information architecture of how do you collect content and how do you gather that from groups, right? Showing that it's not only student work, but you get the higher level of, oh, I actually have to meet with all these other departments and help them figure out what the heck they should do. So how do you gather that information? Do you lead workshops? Do you attend workshops? Do you hope to lead them one day? So just what overall is that full process that helps you get to an end solution. Like for each of my projects, I do also a strategy doc, which I tend to build it in InDesign kind of like a book, because I could just export a PDF and do like a collect for output. But for every project, big or small, sometimes those strategy books that sum up my process are 5 pages, if it's like a quickie project. Some of my current projects, there's probably 1,000 wireframe comps, give or take, and the strategy doc is like 250 pages big. Just documenting everything. Here's the workshop that led to this, that led to that. So just document as much as you can and try to clearly communicate that process. Because oftentimes companies, if you're going for a UX role specifically, they'll probably give you a test too. That could be a few hours long, where sometimes they'll just give you a dry erase marker and a giant whiteboard and say, here's your 1 paragraph challenge, work out a solution. Other times they'll give you a take at home test, and they expect you to come back with wireframes and or comps, depending if it's a partially UI role. So process, not just the final piece. And that's across the board with branding or anything. When I used to hire with branding and graphic design roles, if I saw just a cool logo, I'm like, oh, well, that's cool, but what tools did you use? What was your process? How many concepts did you show? And then how many were taken back and refined, and why? Was this your favorite one that was even chosen? Did you like another one better? So all that process stuff for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Eric.
Hey, Monica, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Oh, of course, it's fun.
It's kind of a 2-part question. You had said, so when you said the wording is important, I know there's so many applicants now and everything is gone like virtual based. And I was wondering, is there like an algorithm within LinkedIn? Because now applying through LinkedIn, you don't add like really a lot of cover letters. Sometimes like applying, you'll see like 200 applicants, 100 applicants, 75 applicants. So the competition is really high.
Yeah.
Especially now that like positions, we're competing with not even local to San Diego, they're remote positions.
Yep.
And I know you said that like you revamped completely yourself as a whole, and like you went more UI UX direction. Is rephrasing, say for myself, like because I'm still undecided, do I want to continue forward with like my bachelor's degree? A lot of these positions are saying we want you to have a bachelor's degree. Is there an algorithm or a computer detecting within LinkedIn that is like saying, oh, we choose these people because they have so and so within their application, and then forgetting about the rest of the applicants?
That's a really good question. So I don't have direct insights from LinkedIn on this, but I think there's 2 sides to it, right? There's the search engine optimization kind of algorithms within it, right? So the more words that you have that match up with the jobs that you're applying to, the better, because it will also trigger and give you different job recommendations according to that. So for example, if right now on LinkedIn, you're getting all these recommendations for jobs you're not interested in, it means you need to change your text. Your profile is not saying what you do or what you want to do. And so use a lot of like lists, because a lot of times it's like a slight rewording, and it could really help you with that search, both giving you better recommendations and moving you up the line for them potentially. And when they read it, they get, oh, they understand all these industry terms. That's exactly what we do. So the more that you can kind of align with those dream jobs and the goals, the better. But the bigger part with LinkedIn is your network. They may get 100 applicants per job or whatever, right? But if a friend of a friend emailed them and said, hey, I don't actually know this designer, but my friends say that he's really good and motivated, you should consider him. That is the biggest you could hope for via LinkedIn networking, right? So expand your network as big as you can and be really genuine with people, you know, like, hey, I'm about to graduate. I just like portfolio feedback. And then when you go and get that portfolio feedback digitally, at the end of it, you can ask, you know, hey, do you happen to know anyone that's hiring my specialty? And if you don't, you know, maybe there's someone that you could introduce me to that maybe could give me portfolio feedback that's maybe in that specialty. And then it starts connecting and connecting and connecting, because that network is the main way that most people get hired at the end of the day. Because if you're just kind of cold calling and hitting apply, you're, again, like you said, almost in this long list. But if through your network you spend a little bit of time trying to connect to them somehow and have some kind of connection there, that'll be a world of difference for you.
So it almost goes back to like what you were saying, like instead of before applying to this position, say like throw out to these individuals and be like, hey, I'm a graduate, a recent graduate, this is my portfolio. I was wondering if maybe you guys could take a time and check it out, give some feedback and just connect further, see what their feedback is back, and then kind of move forward in that direction.
Exactly. And when you do that, try to leave as little work for them to do as possible. And what I mean by that, say, you know, I would please like 20 to 30 minutes of your time so I can show you my work and just get honest feedback. How is Tuesday at 2:30 p.m.? Like, give them exact details that all they have to do is say yes, or no, not free, or no, how's Wednesday at 1 instead. Like, make it as easy with as few emails as possible, because less emails equals more chance it's going to happen.
And then when you were saying, like, sorry, it was like a semi-other question, like, because you were saying they check your first project and then your last project. And so there's like 9 projects within it, remove maybe 2, keep yourself limited to 6, keep the top within the first and the last, and then maybe like your process ones in between. Do you think that's more smart, or to showcase more work in just as a whole?
I guess it just depends how on target you feel the work is for the exact job you want. Like if you're putting work in just to put work in, then that's just like fluff, right? Especially if it's not a piece that you totally love and feels represents you, then don't put it in, right? But that's one of those things that's great about a portfolio site is if you don't have that many pieces yet, you know, focus on like maybe 4 to 6. 6 would probably be a good number, give or take. It depends on how big the campaigns are or the work. But put in just a few key pieces. And then later, as you come up with work you like more, ditch the old stuff and swap it. You know what I mean? You could always evolve it and change it. You obviously don't want to have to change it for every different job you apply for, hopefully. Hopefully they're all kind of in the same realm. But know that it can always evolve and change. You don't necessarily want or need to show like 50 pieces. That's overkill, and the odds of someone looking at all of them is slim to none. But oftentimes after the viewer looks at the first 1 or 2 pieces, they'll realize, do they actually want to do the exact job we're hiring for? Are they a match? Does their stuff look like what we want? And then the next question they're kind of gonna glance over, see if you have stuff in their industry, see if you have other pieces with other specialties that they want. So they're kind of looking at that little thumbnail image to sum up what was the specialty of that piece. So whatever you do, don't write the name of the client or put like a logo there. I know that's kind of like a gut check of, oh, I'll just put the names and that'll be great. Unless your work is like Nike and Disney and stuff, don't put the logos and stuff. Show an actual thumbnail of what the piece is, because then they instantly know, oh, it's an app. Oh, it's a print piece. Oh, it's a branding, you know, just what is it? So that'll help you too.
Sylvia, why don't you ask the last question of the night and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, thanks. I was wondering with hiring managers looking at design positions, how important are, in addition to your portfolio site and your LinkedIn, other social media accounts like your Instagram or your Twitter that you might maintain as a designer? And if, like me, you're somebody who's kind of a social media hermit and you don't have that kind of presence, is that to your detriment?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that could kind of, that could go 2 ways for you. If you are a social media butterfly and a partier, it could really hurt you. But if it's very work focused or professional, where you don't have like, you're doing shots and stuff in every photo, then that could definitely help you. I know personally, I don't cyber stalk into the social realm. I like people to be able to have their private life. But I know a lot of other people, that's like the third thing they'll do. They'll go LinkedIn. Who do they know that I know? Do we have mutual acquaintances and network people? That's the first thing they'll look for. You know, and then like what's their talent and specialty and all of that. They'll look at your portfolio, and then they'll go straight to like your Instagram and stuff to see, are they a partier? Are they someone that looks like they're reliable? Mostly the people that I've heard go into the social media is HR teams. So if you're applying for a big corporate position, especially if they have confidentiality around what they do, or if you're going into product development in any way, they're going to do like a crazy background search. Like I pretty much had to like sign my life away for this job and go really in depth on all my stuff. And they did a very, very intense background search. So I'm 100% sure they looked at every social media platform I have. But, but every company is a little different on that. And I personally don't look at that, but a lot of people do. So if you do, and if it's public, try to keep it semi-professional, or make like a side Instagram that's just for your design stuff. Something like that.
That was kind of what I was wondering about. Like, are those pieces how useful are they as like supplements to your portfolio and your resume, as opposed to more personal accounts? Like, does having those put you, is that an advantage, or does it not matter that much?
I think it can't hurt, and it could potentially be an advantage if it is a professional, inspiration boards, for example, or work that you actually did, then it could be really good. But you also want to make sure you're not publishing work that could have confidentiality things, because then you could get in hot water with the companies and or get sued. So just be careful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Monica. This was super insightful. I learned a ton. I'm excited to start building some portfolio websites. So I'll give you a clap on behalf of everyone. Let's give Monica her nice image of everyone. So I think, Monica, it'll work better if you stop sharing.
Oh, okay. Perfect.
What do you want us to do? Do you want us to all like do like 3, 2, 1 cheese?
So yeah, what I was thinking, because honestly, I've seen so many portfolios that come out of your school, and it's amazing work. So I'd love to take a screenshot, and I could do a post on LinkedIn and kind of do a shout out to all of you. And then you never know if that might help your network in some way down the line. So I figured it could not hurt. So yeah, we could just do a 3, 2, 1, and you could smile or make a goofy face or whatever you want to do.
Wait, I'm still seeing your screen share, Monica. Could you?
Oh, you are? Oh, sorry. It says resume share. Okay, there we go. Stop
okay,
share.
Perfect. All right, so let's do it on 3. 3, 2, 1, cheese. All right, perfect.
Act natural, right?
Act natural. The most natural thing ever, to be smiling for an extended period of time on Zoom.
I know.
But yeah, thanks again, Monica. This is fantastic. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks everybody. This is fun, and it's good seeing a lot of familiar faces on these more and more. So shout out to all of you and all your hard work. I know it's tricky making portfolio sites and getting all your stuff together, but it's a fun industry. So keep up the hard work.
Thanks so much, Monica. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Monica.
Of course.
And then for anyone who's in my 163 class, let's take a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 7:20 to do a couple more things before we wrap. But for everyone else who's joining us from other classes, thanks for stopping by, and see you later. Get out of my cloud. No, I'm just kidding. Good night, everyone. All right, guys, let's go ahead and get started. Just want to cover a couple more things tonight. What do you guys think about Monica Moon? That was pretty insightful. I learned a lot from it. Do we enjoy it?
Yeah, that was really cool. It'd be nice if more speakers like that could be integrated into classes, but I know it's one of those tricky things of finding a time that works for people.
Yeah, actually, Tino, we're actually trying to do that more this semester. It was something that Candace came up with. She was like, you know what, like we've got like no human connection over this whole Zoom thing. So let's reach out to our network and try to get people to come in. So we are going to try to do that. But yeah, I agree, especially now. As you guys know, the main project that we're going to do in this class is design and develop your portfolio website. So what I want to do over these next couple of weeks is start planning that out and developing a look and feel for what your website is going to look like. So if you're already in Portfolio, if you're currently a Portfolio A student, we're sort of already doing this, right? But if you're not a Portfolio student, if you're not currently a Portfolio student, what I want you to do is start creating a mood board for your website. And then optionally for everyone else, or I should say for everyone in the class, optionally, you can also start filling out the creative brief that Monica shared with us. I'll post it in Canvas tonight and in the resources so you guys have that template. So if you want to, you can start filling out that creative brief, but for everyone else, some sort of mood board. And once again, if you're in Portfolio A, you're already creating a mood board, so no need to do it again. That sort of satisfies that requirement. Any questions about that, guys? All right, cool. So I wanted to start out by reaching out to you guys and asking if anyone ran into trouble and wants some help with anything. If you want to share a Webflow link, we can kind of go over it in class together. Again, I feel like if you guys are having a problem, there's a decent chance that a lot of people are having that same problem. So yeah, whether it's with the exercise or the site that you're developing, what problems are you guys running into? Anyone want to share?
One of the things that I'm still kind of figuring out is what the appropriate little, I guess, component that you can use in Webflow, and then also kind of utilizing the sizing section of the edit of a designer, because I've noticed that I've run into trouble where I'll set the width or the height to be a certain percentage of the viewport, and then it kind of and then I build it based on that instead of maybe just letting it be auto and then maybe adding some margin. And then especially when you cascade down the different sizes, it just starts breaking, and then it becomes a massive headache to try and fix. And then once you fix it for one screen, then you just kind of add a little bit more problems to the next one. And so that was kind of the hardest thing for me. And I ended up having to completely delete some of the projects and restart, or especially the project one. I think I deleted and restarted that thing 10 times because I would do something and then I couldn't figure out how to undo what I did, and trying to fix it was more of a headache. So it's just kind of still working with understanding the components of Webflow.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so in terms of the components of Webflow, one of the things I want to do after this Q&A is kind of go through some of these items at the top and talk about what they're actually used for. And also just talk about the ones that I don't use, because some of these things I don't think are very useful, or they're kind of legacy items. So we're going to go through that. It's kind of a big question, Tino, but in general, what I recommend that you guys do is try to not space things out with fixed margins and fixed percentages or fixed widths and heights for things. Okay, try to avoid that. It doesn't mean that doing that is always wrong, right? But you kind of want to get things to be generally in the right place using things like Flexbox or Grid, which we're going to talk about today, and then use margin and padding to kind of adjust those things from there. Okay, so if you're taking some element and pushing it way across the screen with a bunch of margin, I saw some guys doing that. That's probably not a good strategy, because that's building in too much of like a fixed area that is going to be really dependent on the screen size that you're designing for. Whereas if you position it to sort of like, go to the general area using something like Flexbox, which is responsive, and then adjust it from there using margin and padding from other elements, you're probably going to have, a better overall solution. Then another thing I'll say is a lot of times you want to use min or max widths or heights rather than fixed heights and widths. Again, it's not a, always thing. Sometimes fixed widths and heights are good, but you might want to think about whether min or max is a better way to go and will provide you a more flexible solution for like the smaller breakpoints. Okay, Shay, before I get to you, Sylvia had something about the Flexbox column spacing issue. What did you find out there, Sylvia?
Should I share my link here?
Sure.
Okay. It's easier to just show it in the editor. A very, very silly website.
Okay, so what did you do here to fix this situation?
This is interesting. There's something here happening I didn't expect, but so I put a 3-column wrapper on these, columns, but then, how we were talking about, there's this issue with padding when you apply it to the columns.
Yeah.
I found if you just decrease the margin on your wrapper by however much you've padded the internal elements, then it takes care of that misalignment.
Yes. Okay. That is the actual normal way to do this. This is kind of the way that Webflow and most developers would handle this exact thing. So yes, I agree with this, this solution. And I'll say, guys, that today we're going to learn about CSS Grid, and you'll probably never do this again with Flexbox. I kind of purposely showed you CSS Grid after Flexbox because I feel like after I show you CSS Grid, you guys won't even want to use Flexbox at all. But there are situations where knowing Flexbox is really useful. So I kind of forced you guys, I kind of tricked you guys into doing a bunch of stuff with Flexbox that you may instead, after today, want to do with CSS Grid. Because CSS Grid is, to me, much more intuitive for designers. And it's just more powerful, generally speaking. Yeah, sorry, guys, for the tricks. Shay, go ahead and ask your question.
So basically what I had, it kind of goes back to that min max that you were talking about with the box, the sizing. So I tried to put a container box within a div block, and I tried to have it set to a specific size. And for some reason, the height or the width, if I changed one or the other, no matter if I like changed the min max for the height or the width, it would still just end up being this super skinny little horizontal line or a vertical line that would go right across my screen.
Got it. Okay, so there are like sometimes some weird things with doing things based off of a percentage of a height that is set on a max height. So you guys will run into that. That's really annoying to me. I wish it didn't work that way, but like sometimes if like a child element is set to a percentage height and then the parent is set to a max height, it doesn't work the same way as if the parent was set to a fixed height. I don't exactly know the reason for it. I asked Skeletor one time and he did have some kind of reason that it's set up that way, but it can be a little bit frustrating. So sometimes in those situations, it forces you to kind of do it a different way. Another thing I'll say, Shay, is I'm going to go over the proper use of containers in a second. You, generally speaking, probably don't want to have a container in a div block. There might be some situations to do that, but I think you might be using containers wrong, and containers impose a kind of secret max width on you. So that also might be another thing. Of course, we don't know what we're doing. Okay, let's go to Alan. Alan, you had a question about the nav bar. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so I tried making the nav bar with the navigation bar element at first, and then I couldn't get my logo fixed in the middle, how you see here, without doing the button that turns the navigation bar when you go down to a smaller breakpoint. So it wouldn't keep the hamburger menu on the smaller breakpoint like the phone display.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you could create your own hamburger menu without the nav bar. You know what I mean?
Yes, totally. Okay, so a lot of you guys went and built nav bars, which is great. Last week, I didn't show you this little trick, which is if you scroll down in the add panel to the bottom here, there's a pre-built element in Webflow called navbar. So if I just drag that into the body, basically what this does is it gives you a little area to put your logo, and that is going to usually link to the homepage, and then it gives you some nav links. And then by default, it's going to hide the nav links for tablet and below and change that to a hamburger menu. But you can also configure that further. If you select that item and then click on this little gear for the element settings, you can change where that menu icon shows up. So you can make it so that it always shows up even for desktop, or you can make it never show up, or anywhere in between. And then you can also do things like open the menu, and that allows you to kind of style this, right? So the point of this navbar element in Webflow is it saves you time, right? Because there's so many websites that use this exact structure of like links, logo over on the left, collapse down to a hamburger menu, menu opens up from the top, right? That is such a common design pattern that Webflow has kind of pre-built that for you just in case it saves you time. That being said, if you have some kind of different navbar design, and even something like this, Alan, where you have the logo in the middle, it might actually be faster to just build the navbar element out yourself. You can build out this navbar totally from scratch, right? And the way you would do that is by having the hamburger menu in the navbar, but on desktop, that hamburger menu is set to display none, right? Remember we talked about display none. So what that does is it makes it so that element doesn't even show up for desktop. And then when you go down to tablet, you would set all the links to display none, and then set the menu icon to like actually display. Okay, so that would give you the same behavior where you're able to responsively show up, make the hamburger menu show up in some breakpoints and make the nav links show up in other breakpoints. But then you also need to build out the menu, right? So the menu is another element that probably is going to get hidden. And you're going to use the interactions panel most likely to get that to like sort of come down when you press the button. We're not going to get into the interactions panel yet. We're going to do that in a few weeks, but just know that you can totally build out your own nav link or your own nav bar. And a lot of times it actually is faster to do that. But if you have this sort of basic layout, this thing can save you a lot of time. Okay. Sylvia, I think this is related. Did you once say that the hamburger menus are on their way out, or am I imagining things? I don't think hamburger menus are on their way out. If anything, I think they're kind of on their way in, or not their way in, but I think they're becoming even more popular as people design mobile first. I actually see more sites where the desktop version even uses just a hamburger menu. So I don't think so. I mean, I think the hamburger menu is here to stay because it's become one of those conventions that everyone knows, right? Everyone now knows that 2 or 3 lines is a menu that drops down, and that is such a common design pattern that I have a feeling it's there to stay. One thing that I am seeing a decent amount is hamburger menus for mobile breakpoints that are sort of more towards the bottom of the phone, and that's for reachability reasons. Eric, go ahead and ask your question.
I had to. So basically, when I was trying to add an image into the part of the main section, and then I was trying to learn like the absolute and relative, like I was not understanding why the image I was trying to place on it was affecting everything.
Okay, so I'm going to skip that question for now, Eric, because it's dealing with something we haven't talked about. And actually, I was going to talk about this today, but I'm going to leave it to sort of like an upcoming week because I don't want to pile you guys with too much information. But yes, there is this magical area down here called position, and these other kind of positioning elements other than static unlock like a ton of special possibilities for you guys. So if you are trying to do something and you just have no idea how to do it, it might require this kind of positioning element. So you guys can reach out to me or look at that on Webflow University if you want to just get kind of a preview of how that works. But
and then the last one was just relative, I guess. I think Sylvia answered it. Was like, it was the grid system. When I was trying to do the 3, I had to be forced to use the margin. And that was because I was doing div blocks rather than using that grid system that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The relative is, you probably don't need relative in that situation. Relative is there's a couple reasons to use relative. Part of it is just honestly, a lot of times it's just to access what's called the Z index, and sometimes it's for doing sort of transforms on certain elements. Okay, Sylvia, go ahead.
Oh, I think Eric, oh, whoops, yes, you were just talking. I saw your hand. So now I don't remember what I was going to ask. Oh, no. It was that I noticed on the mobile site, I had a fixed background image where the images, where the other elements scroll over it, but that did not work on my phone. Is that pretty common that phone browsers won't support that?
No, background images are supported everywhere. So
that they'd be fixed without scrolling along with everything else, though?
Wait, what do you mean, Sylvia? I guess I'm confused.
So I had a fixed background image that stayed static. It didn't move when you scrolled the page up and down.
Yeah.
But that behavior didn't work on my phone. On
oh,
my
are you talking
iPhone.
about like kind of a parallax image where it stays still even though the rest of the content is scrolling? Parallax is pretty widely supported. So I think, like, I don't know, unless you have like a weird phone or JavaScript to turn on your phone, it should work. So you may be building that incorrectly. If you're using something called Position Sticky, which is one of these things down here, Sticky does have some limitations with browser support. But I don't know, most phones are usually pretty up to date and pretty much support everything. So I think there's probably a good chance that that's built incorrectly or there's some way to optimize it, Sylvia.
It was a background image in the body.
Yeah. I will say, guys, don't put background images in the body. I shouldn't have done that in that first exercise because I think it confused a lot of people. I'll talk more about that in a sec, but background images, generally speaking, shouldn't go in the body unless it's like a single section page. But I don't know, Sylvia, maybe reach out to me so I can look at your thing more specifically because I can't quite visualize it.
Okay, thanks.
All right, guys. So let's move on from Q&A time and go over to this empty project that I created because I want to just go through the kind of add panel over here and talk about what some of these things are. Because I've noticed that a lot of people are using sections or containers or div blocks in kind of weird ways. And I want to just talk generally about the box model and how those things should be structured. So first of all, you always start with a box, right? The first box that you always get no matter what is the box for the body. And I hope you don't mind, Brooke, but I pulled up your website mockup here just so I can use this as an example to kind of draw on. So when we talk about the body of a website, let me go ahead and grab a nice little box situation here. Okay. So when we talk about the body, right, the body box is actually going to be the entire site, right? So or not the entire site, but the entire page. So as you add more things to the body is going to expand and the body is always going to be the entire site. So the reason why you wouldn't add a background image to the body is because, like, let's say we wanted, this background image, this like aquarium image. If we added that to the body, that image would actually stretch and fill the entire height of the entire page, right? Because the body is going to encompass not just the hero section, but all the sections underneath. So a pretty standard way that, Brooke, oh no, yeah, sorry, Brooke. A pretty standard way to section this off further is to use the section elements. Okay, so the section elements, which are up here, these are actually, the truth about these is they're actually no different than a div block, but they are kind of semantically different, right? So the way that we use these section elements is to kind of block off the actual various sections of the site. So let's do that really quickly for Brooke's site here. Let's grab another cool color. There we go. So this would be a section, right? This is the hero section. So that's sort of section number 1. Section number 2 would, I think it would be here. Oops, sorry, it would be here, right? Because this image is sort of part of that section, but it feels like that image is kind of actually crossing over to the next section. It's kind of like, has some kind of margin trick or some kind of positioning trick to get it to like span across the sections. But I really see this as being the section, right? We've got a heading, we got text, and we got a call to action. Okay, then the next section would be the octopus cam. That is definitely a section. Why did I do this in Illustrator? that is a section, right? So that would also have a section box. This, I don't know, you could do this in 2 sections, but I would probably say that this is one big section because it's under sort of a heading. And then we'd have another section for this gallery, and then another section for the call to action. And then finally a section for the footer. We'd probably also use a section box for the footer. So in structuring this site, these would all have some kind of section box that would wrap all of the content kind of inside of these areas. Okay, so that is normally how this would be structured. And then there's another thing in here called a container. So I saw a lot of people using this incorrectly, which is fine. I haven't talked about it at all. First, let's kind of drag a container or a section in here. We'll call this test section, twest section. There we go. And I'll just make it 100 VH so it fills the screen. So what a container is it's a special element that constrains the maximum width of the site. Okay, so this isn't like something that you use just as a div. You specifically use it if you want your content to not go from one edge to the other. Okay, this is a really kind of typical design pattern, right? That when we go to a website, there's kind of like a max width of things. It doesn't happen with all sites, but with most sites in their desktop breakpoint, you kind of, if you keep making your window bigger and bigger, all of a sudden it will stop growing with the site and it'll kind of limit the content. And the reason for that is because, I don't know, you can get into really huge screens. And if you just keep expanding the content, you'll get like massive lines of text that will be way too long. Images will like grow and get huge, right? So those containers are really common. So if I drag this container into this section, you can see that it automatically centers. That's the default behavior of a container in Webflow. And it also has a maximum width, okay? And that maximum width, even though it says none here, is actually, I believe, 940 for Webflow. Okay, so their default container sort of constrains everything to 940. Personally, I think 940 is too narrow. It's sort of based off the 960 grid system, which I don't know, has been around for, I don't even know how many years now, like 15 years or something ridiculous. I personally think that's kind of an old standard that is too constraining. So generally speaking, when I'm using a container, I'll give it some kind of class, you know, maybe even just call it container. And I will change the max width to something that suits my design a little bit more. And a lot of times I use 1200. 1140 is another common number, but it can be anything you want, guys. So, you know, that's what a container does. Anytime you want to constrain your design, you know, basically the content of the design to the center, you're going to use a container. So let's go ahead and go back to this really quick and look at where a container may be used in this site. Let's grab another cool color here. That's kind of a cool color, orange. Okay, so this first section, I think it does have a container here. Okay, so the nav actually would have like a container to sort of constrain the nav. This I don't think has a container, right? Because you could put in a container, but it looks like it's all just centered, right? So that really isn't part of the container. This section definitely has a container. Okay, so the container would probably go here. In the case of this mockup, I mean, this is a little bit approximate, but you can see that around 1250 is sort of where this website is constrained to. Okay, and you can see that that container situation is happening for most of the sections. So most of the content in this website is going to go into a container. So like in a situation like this, where you have some things going outside the container and some things inside the container would only wrap those interior elements, those piece of content, and then these elements that are outside would sit outside the container. They might be sort of a background image on the section element. Okay, so that's how that works. Any questions about that? Any of this stuff so far, guys? Looks like we have a couple. Luke, you said I had a problem with containers on the mobile site. It was too narrow to hold down some of my content, so I switched to a div with margin. Okay, so the default way that containers work is once you go down to smaller sections, right, on the desktop breakpoint, the container kind of puts in this max width. But after you get to smaller sections, it's going to go right to the edge. Okay, so you could put in like padding inside of your container so that you have kind of a fixed margin, right? But by default, the container shouldn't, like really constrain the content at all, other than in desktop. I will say though that it sort of depends on how this works, right? Because sometimes you might do something like say, okay, I don't want it to be 1200 pixels. I want the container to be like 90%, where it's going to constrain the content to 90%. If you do that, then you are going to have the container still do something in the smaller breakpoints, but you can always override that by just simply overriding it, right? We can just say that, okay, it's 90% at desktop, but as soon as we get down to mobile or whatever, we're going to change it to 100% and institute some kind of padding to push the content from the outside. So that is sort of how I would think about that. And Tony, you asked, would a container always be applied to a section or the whole website? Yeah, a section, generally speaking. Yeah, and sometimes it can even be inside of things. Like for instance, let me go back to Illustrator. In this sort of section at the top, this hero section, I would say that this nav is part of the hero section. I would probably put that in the hero section, but the container I would probably put just in the nav. Since it's, that's the only part of this section that it needs sort of constraining. Other questions, guys? Okay, and I will mention some of you guys who were using sections, some of you guys gave the nav its own section, and some of you guys included the nav inside of the hero section. There's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do that, but a lot of times you do want to put the nav in your hero section because let's say you want this hero section to be sized as 100 VH, right? If you put the nav separate in a separate section, it's sort of hard to code the section under that to make both of them add up to 100 VH, right? Because then it won't be kind of incorporating the height of the nav into that calculation. And then another reason to put the nav in the hero section is if you're doing what Brooke did here, where the nav is kind of transparent and the background image is going over or kind of underneath the nav, right? So in this situation, you definitely want it to be in the hero section. And then Sylvia, you asked, what about when you want a sticky nav? A lot of times when you're doing a sticky nav and you have this kind of transparent hero, you actually build a second nav. So you have kind of the nav that's over top of the hero section, but then when you scroll down, there's a secret hidden nav that's kind of either above or it's set to display none that will kind of pop out. And a lot of times those are designed in a different way. You'll see that pretty commonly on websites, that there's kind of like two navs, and the second nav sometimes is a little bit slimmer because it can sometimes be annoying if you have like a really huge nav. If that follows you for the whole site, it'll take up a lot of screen real estate, in the vertical dimension. So you'll get this like nice slim nav that will kind of pop up and will follow you. And we can incorporate that type of thing once we get to interactions. Other questions, guys? Okay, so let's keep going with these different elements really quick. So we've got section and container that we talked about. Columns, just ignore this. This is basically useless. It's almost like a legacy feature. Let's see what it says here. Okay, I was hoping it was going to hate on this and discourage you from using it. Don't use this. Use a grid instead. Okay, and this grid is what we're going to talk about today. And by the way, a grid is really just dragging a grid in from this add panel is the same thing as putting in a div block and then setting the display settings to grid. It's the same thing. Okay. What else we got? And then we have the div block, right? The div block is basically anytime you want a box, whether it's a wrapper or anything else, that's not a section and not a container, right? These are kind of special div blocks. The regular div block is something you can use, for basically all other situations. So, going back to this site, like this button, for instance, let's choose another color. This is like another div block, or this button would be a div block. Everything else here might not need a div block. Like this element would probably just be a, a heading element like an H4. This might be an H1 or an H2. It's probably going to span the full thing. This text is kind of interesting, right? Because it's not going the full width. It's kind of going part of the width, even though the heading is going the full width. So probably the way I would structure this is I would put it in some kind of div wrapper, and then I might set the paragraph inside to kind of like only go to like 60% of the div wrapper that's inside. So I might set the width of this to kind of 60% for the desktop site, and then this would probably just be a full block element. Okay, so that's kind of how this breaks down in the box model. All right, let's keep going here. So list, usually you can ignore this. This is basically if you want to do bullet points or a numbered list. In web's dev speak, this is called an unordered list for bullet points, or an ordered list for a numbered list. This is something that might happen if you're like doing a blog post or something, but it's usually going to be embedded in a rich text element. So I've never used this before, but in case you need to, it's there. Link block is definitely something we need to talk about. Okay, so link block is a div block that actually links somewhere. Okay, so they're basically the same thing, but when you use a link block instead of a div block, you get this dialog that allows you to link it to somewhere. So that can be a URL that can link you to an external page, or it can link you to a page inside of your project. Okay, so if you're going to link to some other page in your site, you want to do it through this. You don't want to do it through an external URL, because this will continue to work like regardless of the domain situation that's happening in here. Okay, so it'll just automatically link to the correct target, and then there's a bunch of other options other than that, including like downloading some kind of attachment, or even going to a specific page section. So you can create what's called an ID on your sections and have it kind of go to a page and then also scroll to a specific anchor. Sylvia asked, does that also make the entire link block clickable, not just the text inside like a button? Yes. So that entire div is going to be the link. So if you guys want to create a button that has like an icon in it, for instance, a lot of you guys ask that. The button element is a nice shortcut, but all this is, honestly, is it's just a text link that has padding and a background color set to it. Right? It's really just a text link. So there's no way to put other things inside. It's great if you want a basic button, but if you want some kind of button that's got like, an arrow in it or whatever, or, some kind of fancy feature, a lot of times you're going to build that out of a link block, and you're going to kind of construct the button from scratch using a link block. Then the last thing I'll mention about link blocks is that divs can be converted to link blocks. So let's say you like build something in a div, and then all of a sudden you realize, I want this to link somewhere. You can just right click on any div and say convert to a link block, and that will just change it to give it an anchor, which is really, really useful. There's been a lot of situations where I'm like, I should be able to click that and link it to somewhere. So this will save you a lot of time. You won't have to like rebuild it from scratch. Oh, Luke just said that in chat. Thank you, Luke. And then Haley says, is that good for the page logo? Are you talking about the logo in the nav, Haley? Yes, I would wrap the, what's it called? The logo in the navigation with a link block. That's usually the way I would do that. And then Archie, you said, so a link block can be used to link inside pages. Yes, you can link to pages. You can link to pages. Yeah. That's usually the main thing that you're going to do with a link block. All right, let's keep going here. We talked about buttons. We've got all the text situations. The only thing we didn't really talk about here is like text links and rich text. For the most part, I would ignore rich text. The main time this is going to be used is, let's say you're doing some kind of blog and you're populating the blog article content from the CMS. Don't worry if none of what I said makes any sense. That might be a situation where you use a rich text element. But generally speaking, I don't recommend designing with these, right? Like rich text is like this thing where you can like go inside and add multiple paragraphs and multiple styles, and even embed like things like image and video inside of this block. Okay, but you don't want to design this way. This is really something that is mostly going to be used for what's called dynamic content. So in general, I would probably ignore that. And same with block quote. I don't think you're going to use this very much. Text link, again, is pretty similar to a button, but it's just a piece of text that links you somewhere. So you can style this however you want. It has some basic styling, which is kind of annoying, that you can kind of go in and undo. It'll always be blue and it'll be underlined. So you have to go in and kind of reverse that settings that Webflow kind of gives you by default. Okay, going down further here, ignore CMS. We're actually going to not talk about this into the second project, but this is going to unlock the possibilities of dynamic content. One thing that I saw a lot of is confusion between where to use an image versus a background image, right? So generally speaking, if you want content to go on top of the image, a background image is usually going to be a little bit better. An image is kind of like a div block, right? So an image is an actual block that's going to affect all the other elements around it. So some of you guys tried to build your hero section with like a big regular image, and that became really challenging because the image kind of pushes all the other content underneath it, right? Because it's an actual block element. So for background images, make sure that you just take a div or a section or whatever it is, and then scroll down into here and actually add the background image through that styling property. Okay. You got video, YouTube, you guys can play around with that. There's form elements here. We're not going to talk about this yet, but these are ways to add more elements to a form that you're creating. And then at the very bottom, there is this section where they have a bunch of pre-built components. Again, these are all things that you could probably build without that much difficulty in Webflow, just using like divs and other things. But these are like common design patterns, and they've kind of given you these shortcuts to speed up your work. So the navbar is one that I use all the time. The navbar is super, super useful because it sort of covers that common design problem where you have the basic navigation with the logo on the left, the links on the right, etc. So that is something I use a decent amount. You guys might also check out the tabs. The tabs is pretty useful as well. Basically, what it allows you to do is it gives you, in the settings here, you can pick how many tabs you want, and then you can sort of switch these tabs and put different content inside, so that when someone comes to your site, they can click on whatever tab and it'll automatically switch that content to the content that's kind of embedded in that tab. And you can style this however you want. You don't even have to have the tabs up here. You could move them somewhere else. So this can be really, really helpful. Tony, you asked if you want to add an icon, do you add a PNG? Normally you're going to want to use an SVG for an icon. SVG is going to perform a little better because it's a vector item. So it's actually usually going to be smaller, but also it's a vector, so it's scalable. So definitely recommend an SVG. How will tabs look on mobile? Depends on how you style them. I guess by default they stack. But yeah, you can style them however you want. These are just basically div blocks, and you can choose how these work. The only one of the problems with working with these pre-built elements is if you accidentally delete part of this, you almost have to like start over, right? Like if you somehow like delete this tabs menu, like no, don't delete it, right? Because there's no way to get it back. And that tabs menu is like the only way to kind of style the interaction that is kind of pre-built into that element. So if for some reason you don't want part of the pre-built element, generally speaking, I would just choose to hide it rather than delete it. Because if you want that back, you're probably going to have to go back in, add a new tabs, and kind of start over. Okay, so the tabs is pretty useful. What else do we got? Lightbox, I don't really use this, but if you want your images to be able to have the behavior that when you click on them, it gets bigger, so you have a bigger image, that Lightbox thing is pre-built for you. There's also an embed. So if you want to embed some kind of code from somewhere else, that will allow you to embed HTML. And then the slider is pretty useful as well. The slider is, one of the things I like about their slider is it's really flexible, right? It's not like the typical slider that you get with a template website where they ask you like, what's the first image? What's the second image? These aren't just images. Each slide is a div that you can style however you want. So it's not just sliding images. You can put anything you want into the slider and kind of slide that around, and you can do different content for each slide. And just like all the other pre-built elements, if you go to the settings panel over here, you can choose how this works. You can play around with the animation. You can add like more slides. And then you can also like toggle to different slides, which will allow you to populate the content of like slide 3, for instance. I can go over to slide 3, put the content in, etc. Okay, and again, if you want, like, if you don't want this nav, for instance, don't delete it, just hide it. Okay, just hide it. And then one complaint I have about the slider, I guess, is it doesn't work that well with swiping. It does support swiping, but it only supports it in the smallest breakpoints, and it's a little bit clumsy. It's not like the really cool sliding where you swipe across and the content like moves with your finger. It's kind of like you swipe and then the pre-loaded animation kind of plays after you swipe. So that's my only kind of complaint about the slider. Yeah, background video is really useful. If you want your video, or if you want your background to be some kind of ambient video that just loops, you can upload a video here. It gives you the formats that you want to upload it in. Generally speaking, MP4 is what I use, and then it's going to automatically transcode that content into all the other formats that it needs internally, which is really great. Obviously, keep your background videos small. It limits it to 30 megabytes, but you probably want it to be much smaller than that, right? Because if you go to a website and it forces you to download a 30 megabyte video to like view the hero section, it's going to be really lame. It's going to take a long time. Any questions about any of these random elements that we went over, or the box model? Anything else, guys? All right, cool. Let's jump over and talk about one more thing today, which is the CSS grid. Okay, so this is the last. Oh, okay, Luke has a question. Sorry, Luke, can a slider and a background video also be placed within a smaller div block? Yes, so you can place a slider inside of a smaller div block. You don't have to, there's no limitation on where you place a slider. I happen to place it kind of just into the body or whatever, but it can go into a div, it can go into a grid, it can go into a flex box, and you can also change, like the container of the slider. You could like make this into a flex box or different elements. I guess it doesn't allow it to be a grid, and that makes sense. And then Jamie, you said you could go in and change the code to slide in a different way, right? Did you ever pass a built website for some small edits to a developer and then go in and change the code yourself? I've never actually done a professional project in Webflow, believe it or not. I've always worked with a development team. I think, Jamie, if you wanted to have a slider that worked a little bit better, probably what you would do is use the embed functionality and do it that way. It's probably, I'm guessing that's the best way to do it, rather than trying to like edit the Webflow slider. I think that's probably the workflow that I would recommend. I think I've even done this before. If you like search for Webflow slider and all these things, there's like some people who have talked about like given instructions or tutorials on kind of how to get that kind of thing done. Okay, and then cover royalty-free videos. Oh, that's really cool. I've always wanted something like that, kind of like an Unsplash for videos. That's great. Yeah, and then Tino, injecting custom code. Yes, the embed. I don't know why I can't say embed. I just don't know how to say that. That is probably what I would use to create some kind of like better slider solution. All right, let's take a 5-minute break, because I felt like I talked so much there. My voice is dying. So let me go grab a drink. Let's come back at 8:10 and we'll talk about CSS Grid. See you guys then. All right, guys. So let's talk a little bit about CSS Grid. This is actually a pretty new feature. Well, it's actually not that new in Webflow, but it's kind of new to me. It hasn't been around that long. It's one of the newer kind of big additions to Webflow. And also, it hasn't had really great browser support for very long. It's actually kind of new to CSS. So I don't know. I guess if you were building a client site, you might worry a little bit about that, whether CSS Grid is going to be supported in all browsers. But I would say for your guys' portfolio site, I wouldn't worry about it. Just use CSS Grid, all day long. I mean, I guess the reason that I'm not really worried about it is, I don't know. Do you really want to work for someone who's like using Internet Explorer like 11 or something on their computer? I don't know. I feel like for the audience that we're going for, they're most likely going to have a browser that supports CSS Grid. It's pretty widespread. It's really just kind of people on old PCs that also haven't updated, that also haven't downloaded Chrome or Firefox that we're talking about here. So I would say, for this project, for your portfolio, just kind of use it without worrying about it. So what is CSS Grid? Like Flexbox, it gives us a ton of control over how to kind of manipulate elements. It also works like Flexbox in that you kind of create a parent element, kind of a wrapper, and that is the thing that you set to CSS Grid. And the settings on that wrapper kind of control the content inside. Okay, so in a way, it has some similarities to Flexbox. Let me go ahead and add another section. I've got the hero section and this 3-column section. Let's add another one underneath that. Okay, and moving things around in this navigator, I've never found like I'm so bad at it. I don't know if there's like a better way to do it, but it's always really clumsy to me. Let's call this we'll call this grid section. There we go. And yeah, let's go ahead and drag in a container. Let's go ahead and put in a container. Yeah, it's touchy. I agree, Sylvia. It's not the best. Not that I have a good suggestion on how to improve it, but it's a little bit finicky. Okay, so container, let's go ahead and give this a class. We'll just call it container. And I'll expand the max width of this as well to 1200, which is kind of my default. Okay, so we've got a section, we've got a container, and let's go ahead and drag in a div block. And this div block is going to be our wrapper for the grid element. And by the way, you can also just drag in a grid, but for some reason, the way I do it is I do a div and then I set that to a grid. Okay, so when you do that, you get this interface. Okay, so you can kind of like edit the grid, and the settings that you put in this grid, like I said, are going to affect the content that's inside of it. Okay, so for now, let's talk about kind of what you can do here. Right, by default, it gives you 2 columns. You can add columns to this. Okay, so you can add as many columns as you want. You can also change the gutters. Okay, so you can change the horizontal gutters, and then you can also change the vertical gutters. Or if you hold down Shift, you can change both of them at once. Okay, and then you can also change the relative sizes of these columns. Okay, so there's something called a fractional unit. That's an FR. And right now there's 5 columns, and all of them are set to 1 FR. And so the result of that is each column is going to take up 1/5 of the room in this grid. Okay, if I set one of these to a higher amount, like if I set this one in the middle to 2 FR, now this is going to take up 2/5 of the space. Or is it 2/6? I don't know how to do math, but anyways, this is going to be twice as big as the ones that are set to 1 FR. Okay, so that's how these units work. You can play around with these numbers, but a lot of times instead of playing around with these numbers, what I do is I have elements span multiple grids. Okay, because that kind of is intuitive to me because it's how we work with grids in design, right? We have a grid system, and elements span across multiple grids, and that functionality is available in a CSS grid. Okay, and then also, over in this area over here, you can add and remove rows as well. So you can just kind of play around with these different settings. Okay, when you're done, you can click this little button to stop editing the grid. And now you have a div block, and you see these kind of grid lines inside. Really quick, let's add some padding to this, just so it's not so glued to the bottom. So let's go to our container, and we'll add some padding in here just to make this section a little bigger. And let's also give this a class name. So let's call this our grid wrap. Okay. Any questions so far? Sylvia said it kind of seems like a modernized HTML table. Yeah, kind of. We used to, way back in the day before like CSS was even around, we used to design columns in websites with tables, which was a nightmare for anyone who was coding back then. Okay, so let's work on this. Okay, so now let's go ahead and grab a div and drag it into our wrapper. Okay, so we've got a grid set up. Let's go ahead and put in a div element inside. Okay, and when I drop it inside, by default, that div block is going to just occupy sort of the first module of that grid. Okay, let's really quickly, let's give this, let's just give it some height. I'll give it, or actually I'm gonna give it a min height of 200. And I'm gonna change the color of this to just something so we can actually see it. Okay, so we've got our div block in here, and if I kind of copy and paste this div block, okay, so that's gonna add more of those div block elements to this grid. It's gonna just kind of populate all of the different kind of modules in this grid. Okay, so that's kind of how it works by default. And then you have control over whether these div blocks span multiple columns. Okay, so if I want this first one to span across multiple columns, I can just sort of take this little anchor and drag it across. Okay, so I'm dragging it, I'm telling it to span multiple columns, and then that will span multiple columns. Okay, so super, super easy and intuitive. And the wonderful thing about this system is you can change the spanning of columns and also the number of columns and rows for mobile breakpoints. Okay, so if we kind of go down to smaller breakpoints, you can see that it's responsively sizing these columns based on the fractional units, right? It's sort of keeping that structure. But let's say that we wanted to have this be a little bit different. Like for tablet, maybe we just want to have, I don't know, some kind of different layout here. What we can do is we can go in here and edit things like the column spans. Okay, and that's not going to affect the desktop breakpoint. It's only going to affect that for the lower breakpoints. Okay, so that gives us super finite control over how our content gets laid out across responsive breakpoints. It's super, super useful. Okay, so let's go back. Let's undo this. Let's go with a really simple example. Okay, so we've got 4 columns. We've got 4 div blocks. If we wanted to have that break down to 2 columns for tablet, okay, a couple ways we could do that. Neither one of these is like more correct than the other. But you could either edit the grid and kind of add an additional row. Okay, and then you can kind of like manipulate these spans so that they kind of occupy 2 columns each. Okay, so that will give you that thing that we want with 2 columns, right? Another way to do that, if I undo this, is I can go in to the grid and I can remove columns. So I can actually remove two columns, and that is only going to affect the tablet breakpoint and below. Okay, so even though I actually completely removed columns from the grid element, it's not going to affect the parent element. Okay, and then I could do the same for mobile. Let's say I wanted to break it down to 1 column for mobile. I can go in to edit my grid and delete another column. Okay, and that's going to make it stack on top of each other. And you can see it did this even though I didn't manually add 4 rows. It has this feature where it kind of adds rows for you. It automatically will add rows if it needs to kind of have space for all the content that you have inside. Okay. Any questions about this so far? Okay, are we seeing the possibilities here, right? There's so many things that we can do with this. And then Sylvia, you asked what happens if you hide a module. Hiding is, okay, well in this situation, it's a little bit weird because these are all the same class. So if I hide it, it's going to hide all the modules, right? But let's say I wanted to hide this specific one. I could give this a subclass of like blue, and then let's just change it to blue so that we can actually see what we're doing. And by the way, I'm doing this in the mobile breakpoint, right? I should be doing it in the desktop breakpoint, but whatever, it's fine. Okay, yeah, if I hide this, I believe what will happen is it'll go away and all the other things will kind of flow around it. Yeah, so that will just kind of flow. Everything else will kind of flow around it. So the default behavior is as you populate the grid, it'll kind of add into the first module and then the second module, and it'll fill up the first row, and then it'll go down to the second row. Okay. All right, let me back out of that. And then another thing I want to mention, guys, is there's something called manually positioning. Okay, and that happens in the actual element level controls. Okay, so like I said, by default, the first div is going to like fill up this first box, and then the second div is going to fill up the second box, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, if I try to sort of drag this, actually, hold on, let me first add a second row. Okay, so I've got a second row. If I try to drag this into that second row, it's not going to do anything because it's set to auto, right? It's set to auto, so it's automatically just going to stay where it is. Okay, but I can set this to manual, and that will allow me to kind of drag it wherever I want. Okay, so that will kind of allow me to get finer control, and I can kind of override for any element that's set to manual, that behavior of it kind of flowing from row to row. Okay, so that is, again, super, super powerful. And sometimes you'll get really complicated situations where you're trying to drag things around and it's really confusing. If that's happening to you, it probably means that you need to set them to manual. Okay. Because you'll get, I don't know, you'll get in weird situations. You'll see what I mean. Any other questions, guys? All right, so really quickly, let's rebuild this. Let's rebuild this old design with grid, right? Currently, it's built with a flex box, so we have a container for the flex box, and then we have the flex child. Those are set to 33%. So that, you know, we have this kind of behavior. So let's go ahead and try to change the flex wrap. Let's change that to a grid. Okay, so immediately it kind of broke, right? We need to have a third column in here to get obviously a 3-column layout. So let's add a third column. Okay, now it's kind of working, but it's doing weird stuff. And the reason for that is because we made these 33% width for the whole flex situation. So if we just make these 100% width, we're going to get that behavior. We also have some other weird things in here, right? Like we have all this like padding. We don't need this padding anymore because that padding will be handled by this, right? Now we can use this to pad our elements. And, you know, instantly, you know, remember we had that whole conversation about like, how do you add the negative margin to cancel out the padding that you're putting on the elements, right? No need to even think about that anymore, right? Because now we can just use a CSS grid. It gives us really finite control. We don't have extra padding added to the outside, which means we can also go back here and like reset this like stupid negative margin that we had to put in to kind of counterbalance that. And it just makes our life so much cleaner, so much nicer. Luke, it's magical. Yes, it's magical. It's magic, guys. Okay, and then if we wanted to get that same responsive behavior where on mobile, it broke down to stacking on top of each other, right? Again, we can go back to the parent element, edit the grid, and let's just go ahead and delete 2 of these columns, right? So if we delete 2 of those columns, then it's going to stack on top of each other. It looks like we have a lot of extra kind of margin in these. Yeah, we have like 60 margin, so we can reduce that if we want those to be a little closer. Okay. Let's look at one more example. I built kind of a quick little thing here in Figma. There it is. Okay, so I built this kind of, I built this kind of grid situation, right? This, I'm sure you could do this with Flex. There's, you know, you could do this with Flex, but it would be really annoying to do, right? In grid, this is pretty easy, right? Because all we have to do is create a 3x3 grid, place some div elements inside, and then make one of those div elements larger, right? We can make one of those div elements span 2 columns and 2 rows. Okay, so let's go ahead and build that out really quick. Let's go back in here into Webflow. So inside of my container, I'm going to go ahead and again add a div and set that to be a CSS grid. And let's go ahead and give that a class. Oh, I always forget to do this. You kind of click it and then you want to give it a class, but it kind of grays that out. So first, let's just configure this, right? We want 3 columns and then we want 3 rows. Okay, and then we can rename this. Let's call it grid wrap 2 because I don't want it to inherit grid wrap 1 I already defined earlier. So I'm going to call this grid wrap 2. And then really quickly, let's go ahead and build out one of these elements. I'm going to start with the smaller ones, right? Because this one is just going to be kind of a bigger version of this kind of standard element. So I've got an image. So I think what I'm going to do is use a background image, right? Because in this case, as opposed to here, right, I have the text coming on top. So that kind of clues me in that, okay, this should probably be a background image because it's actually being used as a background. So let's go into Webflow and we'll add a div block into our grid. We can call this div grid item. Okay, and we can go ahead and give this a background image. Let's go ahead and add that. We can set it to cover and we can choose one of these images. Let's also center that. Okay, and then we'll also give this some height. We need to give this height because since it's a background image, it's not going to actually affect the height of the div block at all. So let's go ahead and give it a min height of 250. All right, there we go. Also in this design, we have kind of white text coming on top of the image. So I've included like a little bit of a filter on top, right? There's like a solid on top that's kind of darkening the image down to make sure that the text is readable. So we want to put that in as well. And we can do that just by adding a second background. Okay, so we have the image background and we can actually click plus and add a second background and we can choose a solid color for that. Okay, and then the solid color, we can just use black and turn down the opacity to 20%. Okay, so that's gonna darken the image a little bit. And then let's go ahead and drag in a heading into the grid item. And we'll use like an H3, grid item heading. And let's just go ahead and style this really quick. White, we'll just say that it's 36. That's probably a little big, 32. Line height 1 EM, and then let's say Poppins. Bold is fine. And then let's go ahead and take off this default margin, right? Because it's giving us the default margin from the H3 element. We don't really want that. We also want this to kind of anchor into the bottom corner. Okay, so we can do that by just changing our grid item to a flexbox, right? So let's make that a flexbox, and then we can have the child elements inside just get positioned towards the bottom and to the left. Okay, so bottom left justification, and then we can just put in some padding, right, to kind of push that inwards however much we want. Okay, so that's our basic element. A couple questions from chat. Jamie, when deciding between Flexbox and Grid, which cases are obvious and which cases can go either way? Yeah, it's kind of up to you and your style. I actually use Flexbox more than a lot of people do. Most Webflow, most web bros, as we call them, like are all about the grid. They love Grid. They're obsessed with it, and they will do anything to make the grid work over a Flexbox. The reason I use Flexbox is because I don't know, I have a lot of website experience under my belt in other projects, and I'm just used to kind of the behavior of a Flexbox. So somehow a lot of things, the Flexbox kind of clicks for me. But it's up to you, Jamie. Generally speaking, this is something that I learned from Webflow University. This is how they define it. They say if it's a 2D grid, like if it's a 2D layout, then use a grid. If it's a 1D layout, then use a Flexbox. That's what they say. I personally think that, you know, even for a lot of 1D layouts, like this is technically a 1D layout, right? Because we just have 3 elements and they're kind of positioned horizontally. I personally think that this is easier to use a grid for. Yes, Sylvia, what does 1D mean? One-dimensional, right? So like in the case of, let's go back to Figma. So in the case of this layout, right, we have basically 3 elements and they're just being positioned across 1 dimension. Whereas in this layout, we have, you know, 6 elements and they're being positioned you know, both across the horizontal and the vertical dimension. So in this case, we definitely want to use a CSS grid. Here, we could really easily use a Flexbox, but I personally would still use a CSS grid here, just because, you know, it gets kind of messy with all of those columns and spacing. The CSS grid makes it much easier. So yeah, I think for me, Jamie, I generally use a CSS grid, but you know, if it's something really basic, like if I'm just trying to center something or anchor something to the side, I'll use a Flexbox. Sylvia, can you add a second background to any element? Yes, you can add as many backgrounds on top of each other as you want. Jamie, you want to be a web bro. Cool. Yeah, don't we all? And then Tony, you said if you wanted to add a button to that section, would it be part of the grid or would it have to be its own div? Depends on what you want. Like if you wanted to add a button to this element, you would just wrap it in a div, but you can add anything to these grid items, right? It doesn't have to be a div. You can add whatever you want. Like I could add a slider into one of these grid elements, right? And now I have like a slider inside of that grid. You could do the same with a button. Okay, so we can drag a button into here. All of a sudden we got this like massive button, right? So these elements can be anything you want. It can be a Flexbox, it can even be another grid. So you could like grid inside of the grid, right? And then you could like grid inside of that grid. You could go as deep as you want, guys. Yeah, there's no kind of limits to that. All right.
Do one question really quick, Bradford?
Yeah, go ahead.
If you're doing the heading and you're adding padding into that one grid item,
yeah,
what happens if you drag that to cover like all four of those top four? Like if you drag it to cover multiple grid items, does that padding apply to all of them?
So the padding is a fixed amount, right? So in this case, I'm doing 10 pixels of padding, right? So when I drag this to be like over multiple area, it's still just going to be 10 pixels. And since I'm using a Flexbox, it's just going to anchor this to the bottom of that element no matter what, right?
But so you're only adding padding to that one box though, right? You can add, like, could you add a different amount? I don't know why you'd want to do that, but could you add a different amount of padding? Like you can style that grid item separately from one of the other grid items.
Yes, if it's a different class. Okay, so this is built out now. So let me go ahead and copy it. I'm going to copy this item and I'm just going to paste it. Okay, so I'm pasting multiple of those elements in here. So now I have 6, which is like the total amount I need for this layout, right? 1, 2, 3, yeah, 6. Currently, if I like, okay, so let's go ahead and do this. Right, well, I'll take this first one and I'll drag it to make it larger. Okay, so now instantly I have that layout that I want. And then your question, Haley, is like, if I change the padding of this big one, is it going to affect the padding of all these smaller ones? Yes, because they're all the same class. They're all a grid item, right? So if I go in here and change this padding, it's going to change all of these paddings. But if I wanted this one to be different than the other ones, all I would have to do is go over here and create a combo class and make it called like grid item big, right? And now I can change this padding and it won't affect the other ones. Okay. Other questions? All right, so we did it. We got our layout, guys. It looks great. Sylvia asked, does Webflow do ID? Yes, it's located in here. So you can add an ID to certain elements if you want, but generally speaking, classes is kind of how things work. The only time that I really use ID in Webflow is to tag sections if I want to like scroll to a certain section. Actually, there are some other reasons to use it. Like you might use it in interactions if you want it to happen for a very specific element, but there's kind of like built-in ways to do that. Okay. All right, so last thing before we wrap up, we've got this grid. Let's just make it responsive. So for the responsive design, we just want it to stack. Okay, so that's super easy. Let's go back into here. So if we want it to stack, well, first of all, what's going to happen when it goes to tablet? Let's fix this, right? Because we have a container for the desktop breakpoint that is kind of separating it from the edge. But for tablet, it's all the way on the edge, right? It's all the way edge to edge. So if we don't want that behavior, we can go to our container and add some padding in here. Oops, I didn't mean to do that on all 4 sides. Okay, so in the case of this design, let's add 20 pixels of padding. We can keep this design if we want, or maybe like for tablet, for instance, we could, I don't know, change this. Like maybe we want it to be 200 instead of 250 to kind of keep that general shape. Maybe we want to reduce the size of our headings a little bit so they don't get like awkwardly big. For this next breakpoint, these are definitely getting a little small, right, for mobile. So now I think we can, let's go ahead and just turn this into a 2-column layout, okay? Even though that's not how I designed it, let's go for a 2-column layout. So let's go into our grid settings. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go into our grid settings and let's delete a column. Okay, and then, yeah, instantly, did that work? Let's see. No, it almost worked, but this first one is still spanning across multiple columns. So if we just kind of tidy that up, right, make it so it's fitting into one, it's going to fix all the rest of them. Okay, so that's super easy. And then for the smallest breakpoint, if we want it to just all stack, we can edit our grid and just delete another column so that we have just one column. And there we go, instantly working. And by the way, I personally like to delete columns rather than do it the other way around. Some people do it kind of this other way where they like start adding a bunch of rows and then they like reposition these elements to kind of like span, like this is going to span 2, this is going to span 2, this is going to span 2, right? And that does work, but it can get a little bit messy. And then you can also run into like other problems here where, I don't know, something is happening where these things are kind of stacking up with the margins in between. So personally, I just like to delete columns to kind of keep things simple. So like, let me go back and do that. All right, delete, easy. All right, a few questions in chat. Luke, can you explain minimum height versus fixed height one more time? Yes, sure. So, okay, let's go back to this kind of big breakpoint, right? I set this to 250 minimum height. I could, in this case, just as easily set this to just 250 height. Okay, I'm going to remove the minimum height. Okay, something weird happened. I don't know what happened. But anyways, I think, let's see. Why did that happen? I almost feel like this is a bug. No, maybe it's not. Oh, okay. No, it's not a bug, right? Okay, so this is actually a good reason why to use minimum height, right? Because for this one, for the fixed height, right, it's not allowing this element to be taller than 250, right? With minimum height, basically it was making it so that at the very minimum, these elements were 250, but for this special situation, it was allowing the grid sort of layout to make that item grow, right? Whereas now, since I changed this to just a hard 250, all of a sudden this isn't working anymore because it's not allowing it to actually grow past 250. Okay, so that's a good reason to do that. Another reason to do that might be if you want a box to have like a certain height like this, but then there might be a situation where there's like a bunch of text inside that gets really large. And if you set it to a minimum rather than a fixed, that text that is inside will just grow the box rather than kind of extend past the bounds of the box. Does that make sense? So basically, the min height is more flexible. It gives you exactly what you need, but it doesn't impose extra rules that are going to create problems. Okay, so in general, the minimum height is a little bit better, and this is a perfect example of that, right? By using a minimum height, I gave myself some flexibility. I didn't even realize that a fixed height was going to cause a problem, but it did, right? So by creating it that way, it kind of allowed me to not run into issues. Other questions, guys? All right. Cool. Let's wrap for today. I did post another exercise for you guys. What I want you to do in this exercise is just create another section and use a grid. Okay, so just create some kind of grid section. The only requirement is that I want at least one of the elements in the grid to span multiple columns. Okay, so as long as you span multiple columns with your grid element, we're good. So you can create something like this or whatever kind of layout you want. I also want you guys to keep building your first project site and email me the second section of that project for by Friday. Okay, so just like last week, by Friday, send me that Webflow share link Some of you guys didn't send me the right link. So remember, the share link is what I want, because that is going to allow me to go in and actually change what you're doing and give you some feedback directly in the Webflow interface. Also, guys, next week on Monday is Labor Day, so we're not going to be having class. I'm going to post an announcement, maybe either Sunday or Tuesday, kind of letting you guys know what to do for the week. I think I'm going to maybe I'll make a video to kind of share some of these positioning tricks. So we're going to keep going, but we're not going to have any class on Monday. We're going to kind of work through email. Luke, you had a question. Should we fix our previous section to be grid instead of div blocks? Sure, go for it. Go right ahead. Other questions, guys?
Yes. When you make a share link, does it stay good for forever for any updated version of your project, or should you always make a brand new one for every change you make?
I don't know. I have no idea. Yeah, I don't know. We should test it. I think that it should keep working, but I'm not sure. And I have received dead share links from people before, so I don't know if that was because they made updates to the project, but I don't think so. Yeah, I don't know. If we run into a problem, I'll let you guys know, and we'll kind of fix that. But I don't know what the behavior is on that. Good question, Sylvia. Other questions, guys? All right, cool. Thank you all so much. I hope you're excited to use grids and do things without having to worry about the stupid Flexbox settings. We'll see you guys next week. Once again, on Friday, I want the second section of your site. By Sunday, you're going to turn in exercise 4, and just look out next week for an announcement about what to do next week, since we have no class for Labor Day. Take care, guys. Oh, also start working on your mood boards. If you're not in Portfolio, just start working on those.